Close your eyes and let your mind drift beyond the familiar boundaries of our world, where the desert stretches endless and silent under a canopy of stars that seem to whisper secrets from distant galaxies. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most extraordinary claims in modern history, a story that challenges everything we think we know about what lies beyond our small blue planet. This is a tale of hidden facilities carved into mountainsides, of technology that defies the very laws of physics, and of one man who risked everything to tell the world what he discovered in the shadows of classified government programs. You're about to hear the story of Bob Lazar, a physicist who emerged from the Nevada desert in 1989 with claims so extraordinary that they would forever change how we think about extraterrestrial life and government secrecy. Whether you believe his account or question every detail, there's no denying that his story has captivated millions of people around the world for over 3 decades. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, let this incredible narrative wash over you like a gentle tide, carrying you into realms of possibility that stretch far beyond the ordinary concerns of daily life. Picture yourself driving through the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert on a moonless night. The highway stretches ahead like a ribbon of asphalt, cutting through an ocean of sagebrush and ancient rock formations. The radio crackles with static, then falls silent. Your headlights carve a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless wilderness on either side. This is the kind of landscape where secrets can be buried so deep that they become legends, where the line between reality and imagination grows thin under the weight of infinite sky. Somewhere out there in that darkness, beyond restricted airspace and warning signs that promise swift prosecution for trespassers, lies a place that officially doesn't exist. A facility so classified that its very mention can alter the trajectory of a person's entire life. This is where our story begins, with a man who claimed to have worked on technology that originated not from any earthly laboratory, but from somewhere among the stars themselves. Bob Lazar wasn't seeking fame when he first spoke publicly about his experiences. In fact, he seemed almost reluctant to share what he knew, as if the weight of the knowledge itself was a burden he could barely carry. Born in 1959 in Coral Gables, Florida, Lazar would grow up to become fascinated with the mechanics of propulsion and the fundamental forces that govern our universe. His curiosity led him down paths that would eventually converge at one of the most secretive installations in the American Southwest. The story truly begins in the early 1980s, when a young Lazar was working at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. This wasn't just any research facility, but one of the crown jewels of American scientific achievement, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, and a continuing center for cutting-edge physics research. It was here that Lazar first caught the attention of people whose names appeared in history books, scientists whose work had literally reshaped the world. One particular day stands out in this narrative like a beacon in the darkness. Lazar had arrived early for a lecture by Dr. Edward Teller, one of the fathers of the hydrogen bomb, and a figure whose reputation in the scientific community was nothing short of legendary. By pure coincidence, that very morning, Lazar had appeared on the front page of the local newspaper, featured in an article about his unusual hobby of converting a Honda Civic to run on jet power. The car was loud enough to hear from miles away, and it had made quite an impression around the laboratory. Dr. Teller was standing outside the lecture hall, reading that very newspaper when Lazar approached. The two struck up a conversation about propulsion systems and the outer limits of what might be possible with advanced technology. It was a meeting that would prove to be far more significant than either man could have imagined at the time. Years later, when Lazar decided to return to the scientific community after a brief hiatus, he would send his resume to several institutions, including one addressed to Dr. Teller himself. The response came through EG&G, a defense contractor with deep ties to classified government projects. The job description was deliberately vague, mentioning only that it involved work on advanced propulsion systems at a remote location. The interview process was unlike anything Lazar had experienced before. Psychological evaluations, polygraph tests, and background checks that seemed to dig into every aspect of his personal life. They asked questions that seemed almost absurd at the time. Had he ever been hypnotized? Did he believe in extraterrestrial life? The questions seemed designed not just to assess his qualifications, but to measure his psychological stability and susceptibility to suggestion. After weeks of evaluation, Lazar received word that he had been accepted for the position. The next phase of his journey would begin with a flight from McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, aboard one of the unmarked aircraft that locals had begun calling Janet flights. These white planes with red stripes were a common sight in the Nevada skies, ferrying government employees to classified installations scattered throughout the desert. Most passengers would disembark at Groom Lake, the facility that would later become famous as Area 51. But Lazar's destination lay elsewhere, deeper in the restricted zone. He was directed onto a bus with windows painted black, making it impossible to see where they were traveling. The journey took them across rough desert terrain for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the wheels. When the bus finally stopped, Lazar found himself at the base of a mountain range near a dry lake bed called Papoose Lake, about 15 miles south of the more famous Groom Lake facility. The installation before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. Carved directly into the mountainside were a series of hangar doors, each one camouflaged so perfectly that they seemed to disappear into the natural rock formation. The facility was designated S4, a name that meant nothing to the outside world, but would soon become synonymous with some of the most extraordinary claims in modern history. As Lazar was escorted through the entrance, armed guards made it clear that every movement would be monitored, every glance directed, every step carefully controlled. The first thing that struck him about the interior was the absolute sterility of the environment. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow. The corridors were narrow and seemed to stretch endlessly into the heart of the mountain. There were no windows, no decorative elements, nothing to indicate what kind of work was being conducted here. It felt less like a research facility and more like a vault designed to contain something of unimaginable importance. Lazar was led to a small, windowless room and left alone with a stack of briefing documents. These weren't ordinary technical manuals or safety protocols. Instead, they contained information that challenged the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about physics, about technology, and about humanity's place in the universe. The documents spoke of recovered craft, of propulsion systems that operated on principles completely unknown to conventional science, and of materials that didn't appear anywhere on the periodic table of elements. Among the most startling claims in these briefings was the assertion that some of these craft had originated from a star system called Zeta Reticuli, located approximately 39 light-years from Earth. This binary star system, visible only from the southern hemisphere, had been mentioned in other UFO-related accounts, but seeing it referenced in what appeared to be official government documentation was deeply unsettling. Lazar would later question whether this detail had been deliberately included as a form of disinformation, a way to discredit anyone who might later speak publicly about what they had learned. The briefings outlined several different projects operating under code names that sounded more like something from a science fiction novel than a government research program. Project Galileo, which would become Lazar's primary assignment, focused on reverse engineering the propulsion systems of recovered craft. Project Sidekick explored potential military applications of the technology. Project Looking Glass dealt with the temporal effects that seemed to accompany the operation of these advanced propulsion systems, suggesting that the manipulation of gravity might also involve the manipulation of time itself. As Lazar read through page after page of technical specifications and theoretical frameworks, he began to understand the scope of what he was being asked to join. This wasn't simply a research project aimed at developing new forms of transportation or energy generation. This was an attempt to comprehend and potentially replicate technology that appeared to be centuries, perhaps millennia, ahead of anything humanity had achieved. The implications were staggering, not just for science and technology, but for our understanding of our place in the cosmos itself. The documents made it clear that Lazar would be working as part of a small, highly compartmentalized team. Security protocols demanded that information be shared only on a strict need-to-know basis. He would have access to specific components and systems, but the broader picture would remain largely hidden from view. This approach, while understandable from a security standpoint, would prove to be one of the most frustrating aspects of his time at the facility. How could one properly understand alien technology when you were only allowed to see tiny fragments of the whole? As Lazar finished reading the last of the briefing documents, he realized that his life had just taken a turn into territory that few human beings had ever explored. Whether the information he had just absorbed was accurate or part of some elaborate psychological experiment, he couldn't yet say. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be quite the same again. The comfortable boundaries of conventional physics and established science had been shattered, replaced by possibilities so extraordinary that they seemed to belong more to the realm of dreams than to waking reality. Tomorrow, he would begin working alongside technology that allegedly originated from another world, under conditions of secrecy so extreme that even acknowledging the existence of the facility could have severe consequences. As he was escorted back to the bus for the return journey to Las Vegas, Lazar could only wonder what extraordinary revelations awaited him in the days and weeks to come. Little did he know that his experiences at S4 would eventually make him one of the most controversial figures in the history of UFO research, a man whose claims would be simultaneously celebrated and attacked, investigated and dismissed, believed and ridiculed. His story would ignite debates that continue to this day, challenging us to consider possibilities that stretch the very limits of imagination, while questioning the nature of truth itself, in a world where the most extraordinary secrets might be hidden in plain sight. The desert air was crisp and thin as Lazar made his way back to the facility for what would become one of the most transformative experiences of his life. The routine had already begun to feel surreal, the blacked-out bus windows ensuring that the journey remained shrouded in mystery, the armed escorts maintaining their professional silence, the mountain facility appearing and disappearing into the landscape like something from a fever dream. On this particular day, however, something was different. Instead of being directed to the usual briefing room, Lazar found himself walking down a corridor he hadn't seen before, past security checkpoints that seemed even more stringent than usual. The fluorescent lights overhead cast the same sterile glow, but there was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that made every footstep echo with unusual weight. He was introduced to a man named Barry, a technician who had been working on the project considerably longer than Lazar. Barry's demeanor was calm and measured, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had seen things that challenged the very foundations of reality. This would be Lazar's partner in the most extraordinary research project imaginable, and Barry seemed both eager and cautious about sharing what he had learned. The two men were led to a laboratory space that felt more like a vault than a traditional research facility. The walls were lined with equipment that looked both familiar and utterly alien, instruments that seemed to blend conventional scientific apparatus with technology that defied easy categorization. And there, sitting on a metal platform in the center of the room, was something that would forever change Lazar's understanding of what was possible. It was roughly the size and shape of a basketball that had been cut in half, sitting on a square metallic base. The surface was smooth and seamless, with no visible joints or seams, no indication of how it might have been manufactured or assembled. This, Barry explained with barely contained excitement, was the heart of something far more extraordinary than any conventional power source. This was the reactor that had been removed from one of the recovered craft, and it operated on principles that seemed to mock everything Lazar thought he knew about physics. Barry's enthusiasm was infectious as he began to demonstrate the device's capabilities. When the dome-shaped component was placed onto its base, something remarkable happened. The reactor didn't simply turn on in any conventional sense. Instead, it began to generate effects that shouldn't have been possible according to any known scientific principles. Most remarkably, it produced what could only be described as its own gravitational field. Lazar watched in fascination as Barry challenged him to place his hand near the activated reactor. As he reached toward the device, he encountered a force unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't magnetic repulsion or any kind of electromagnetic field. Instead, it felt as though space itself was pushing back against his hand, creating an invisible barrier that grew stronger the closer he tried to get to the reactor. The sensation was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, a reminder that he was dealing with technology that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. The power source for this impossible device was equally extraordinary. According to the technical documentation, the reactor operated using an element that didn't exist anywhere on Earth's periodic table. Element 115, as it was designated, possessed properties that seemed to belong more to the realm of theoretical physics than practical application. It was allegedly stable, unlike the super-heavy elements that scientists had briefly created in particle accelerators, and it served as the fuel for a propulsion system that could manipulate gravity itself. Barry explained that when element 115 was bombarded with protons in the reactor, it briefly transmuted into element 116, releasing a form of antimatter in the process. This antimatter, when properly contained and directed, could provide virtually unlimited energy with perfect efficiency. Even more remarkably, the element's unique properties seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of its atomic structure, creating a gravitational field that could be amplified and focused through waveguides built into the craft itself. The implications were staggering. If this technology could be understood and replicated, it would revolutionize not just transportation, but humanity's entire relationship with energy and space. Interstellar travel, which had always seemed confined to the realm of science fiction, could become as routine as crossing an ocean. The energy crisis that had dominated political and economic discussions for decades could be solved overnight. The very nature of human civilization could be fundamentally transformed. But as Lazar spent more time studying the reactor and its associated systems, he began to understand the true scope of the challenge they faced. This wasn't simply a matter of reverse engineering technology that was slightly more advanced than current human capabilities. This was like asking scientists from the Victorian era to understand and replicate a modern nuclear reactor, complete with all its safety systems and theoretical underpinnings. The gap between human knowledge and the technology they were studying seemed almost insurmountable. Barry shared troubling information about previous attempts to understand the reactor's inner workings. Lazar's predecessor, another physicist who had worked on the project, had apparently died in an accident involving one of the reactors. In desperation, the team had attempted to cut into an operating reactor to examine its internal structure. The result had been catastrophic, an explosion so powerful that it had been passed off as an unannounced nuclear test at the Nevada test site. The scientist had paid the ultimate price for attempting to unlock secrets that seemed determined to remain hidden. This revelation cast Lazar's work in an entirely new light. He wasn't just studying advanced technology. He was working with forces so powerful and unpredictable that they could literally obliterate anyone who approached them carelessly. The reactor sitting before him represented not just the promise of unlimited energy and revolutionary transportation, but also the potential for destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Despite these dangers, Lazar found himself drawn deeper into the mystery. Each day brought new revelations about the technology and its origins. The craft from which the reactor had been removed was apparently one of 9 different vehicles housed within the facility, each with its own unique design and characteristics. Some were classic disc-shaped craft that matched popular conceptions of flying saucers. Others had more angular, geometric forms that suggested entirely different approaches to the same basic propulsion principles. The diversity of designs raised intriguing questions about their origins. Had they all come from the same source, representing different models or generations of the same technology? Or did they originate from different civilizations entirely, suggesting that Earth had been visited by multiple extraterrestrial species over time? The briefing documents provided frustratingly little information about these broader questions, focusing instead on the technical challenges of understanding and potentially replicating the technology. As weeks passed, Lazar began to develop theories about how the propulsion system might work. The reactor generated gravitational waves that could be focused and directed through the craft's hull using a system of amplifiers and waveguides. By manipulating these gravitational fields, the craft could essentially fall continuously in whatever direction it wanted to travel, moving through space without experiencing inertia or the limitations imposed by conventional propulsion systems. The craft didn't push against air or exhaust reaction mass like a rocket. Instead, it warped the fabric of space-time itself, creating a distortion that allowed it to move instantaneously from one location to another. This explained the seemingly impossible maneuvers that witnesses had reported over the years, craft that could accelerate to incredible speeds without apparent regard for the laws of physics, make right-angle turns without slowing down, or hover motionlessly without any visible means of support. Understanding the theory was one thing. Witnessing the technology in action was something else entirely. Barry had hinted that there would eventually be opportunities to see one of the craft in operation, but Lazar wasn't prepared for the impact that such a demonstration would have on his worldview. The day finally came when he was invited to witness a test flight, an experience that would provide definitive proof that everything he had been studying was not just theoretical, but devastatingly real. The craft they wheeled out of its hangar was the one Lazar had begun calling the sport model, a sleek, disc-shaped vehicle that seemed to embody everything mysterious and elegant about the technology. As it sat on the desert floor under the harsh Nevada sun, it looked almost mundane, like an oversized piece of industrial equipment rather than a machine capable of defying the fundamental laws of physics. But appearances, as Lazar was about to learn, could be profoundly deceiving. When the craft's propulsion system activated, reality itself seemed to shift around it. The vehicle lifted off the ground with no visible means of support, no exhaust, no sound except for a faint electrical hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It hovered motionless for several moments, as if gravity had simply forgotten it existed, before beginning a series of maneuvers that challenged every assumption about how objects moved through space. The demonstration was brief and carefully controlled, but its impact on Lazar was profound and lasting. Here was proof that the technology he had been studying wasn't just theoretical or experimental. It worked, and it worked in ways that made conventional aircraft look like crude mechanical toys by comparison. The craft moved with a fluid grace that suggested it was swimming through an invisible medium rather than fighting against the resistance of air and gravity. As he watched the sport model settle back to the ground with the same effortless precision with which it had taken off, Lazar realized that his life had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. He had witnessed technology that belonged more to the realm of dreams than to waking reality, and the knowledge of its existence would forever change how he viewed the universe and humanity's place within it. The implications of what he had witnessed began to settle over Lazar like a heavy blanket during the quiet bus ride back to Las Vegas. The blacked-out windows that had once seemed like an unnecessary security measure now felt like a mercy, shielding him from a world that suddenly seemed smaller and more fragile than he had ever imagined. How do you return to ordinary life after watching the impossible unfold before your eyes? How do you sit in traffic or wait in line at the grocery store when you know that somewhere in the desert technology exists that could transport you instantly to any point in the universe? These questions would haunt Lazar in the days and weeks that followed, but they were nothing compared to the challenges that awaited him at the facility itself. The compartmentalized nature of the project meant that he was working in almost complete isolation, able to collaborate only with Barry and under the watchful eyes of security personnel who seemed to materialize from shadows whenever conversations strayed beyond the strictly technical. It was like trying to solve a vast puzzle while being allowed to see only a handful of pieces, each one tantalizing in its implications but frustratingly incomplete. The reactor continued to be the focus of his daily work, its smooth surface hiding mechanisms that seemed to operate according to principles that hadn't yet been discovered by human science. Every measurement he took, every test he conducted, only deepened the mystery. The device produced no waste heat despite generating enormous amounts of energy. It created gravitational effects without the massive amounts of matter that conventional physics suggested should be necessary. Most remarkably of all, it seemed to violate the fundamental conservation laws that formed the bedrock of scientific understanding. Barry shared what little additional information he possessed about the broader project. There had apparently been cooperation with Russian scientists in the early stages, a detail that seemed almost surreal given the ongoing tensions of the Cold War. But according to Barry, something had changed dramatically after a major breakthrough had been achieved. The Russians had been abruptly removed from the facility and never allowed to return, suggesting that whatever had been discovered was considered too valuable to share even with allies. The security measures at S4 were unlike anything Lazar had experienced in his previous work at classified facilities. Every conversation was monitored, every movement tracked, every interaction carefully scripted to prevent the accidental sharing of information between different research teams. Scientists working on the metallurgy of the craft hulls were kept completely separate from those studying the propulsion systems. Teams analyzing the control interfaces had no contact with those examining the structural engineering. It was compartmentalization, taken to an almost absurd extreme. This isolation had a profound psychological impact that Lazar hadn't anticipated. Science, at its core, is a collaborative endeavor. Breakthroughs happen when minds meet and ideas collide, when fresh perspectives illuminate problems that have seemed intractable. But at S4, such collaboration was not just discouraged, but actively prevented. Each researcher was essentially working alone, armed with fragments of information, and expected to make progress on challenges that might have stumped teams of the world's brightest minds working together. The frustration of this approach became apparent as Lazar struggled to make meaningful progress on understanding the reactor's operating principles. Without access to other team members' findings, without the ability to share theories or compare results, the work felt more like an exercise in futility than genuine scientific investigation. He began to suspect that this extreme secrecy might actually be counterproductive, preventing the kind of breakthrough insights that the project desperately needed. Meanwhile, his personal life was beginning to show the strain of his involvement in the program. The irregular schedule, the inability to explain his absences, and the constant underlying stress of working with potentially dangerous technology were taking their toll on his relationships. The security clearance process had required him to give written permission for phone monitoring and other forms of surveillance, but experiencing such invasion of privacy firsthand was more unsettling than he had imagined. The calls would come at all hours, summoning him for flights to the facility with little advance notice. Sometimes he would be at S4 for just a few hours. Other times, the work would extend for days. There was no predictable pattern, no way to plan for a normal life outside the project. And through it all, he was required to maintain absolute silence about where he went and what he did, creating a growing chasm between his secret professional life and his increasingly strained personal relationships. It was during this period of mounting tension that Lazar was granted an extraordinary privilege that few at the facility had ever experienced. He was going to be allowed inside one of the craft themselves, not just to study components that had been removed for analysis, but to see the technology in its original context. The opportunity came about because researchers had determined that the placement of the reactor within the craft might be critical to understanding how the entire propulsion system functioned. The craft they selected for this exploration was the sport model that he had witnessed during the test flight, and approaching it on foot was unlike any experience he had ever had. Up close, the vehicle seemed even more impossible than it had from a distance. The hull material appeared to be metallic, but it was cold to the touch in a way that suggested properties far beyond any earthly alloy. There were no visible seams, no joints or fasteners, no indication of how the craft might have been assembled. It looked as though it had been grown rather than built, shaped from some exotic material using techniques that remained completely mysterious. The entry hatch was small and positioned in a way that required crawling to access the interior. As Lazar squeezed through the opening, he found himself in a space that felt both cramped and strangely organic. Everything was curved, flowing from one surface to another, without sharp angles or distinct boundaries. The entire interior was bathed in the same dark pewter color, creating an environment that felt more like being inside a living organism than a mechanical vehicle. The ceiling was too low for him to stand upright, except in the very center of the craft, where the reactor housing created a slightly larger space. Around this central column were arranged 3 small seats, clearly designed for occupants considerably shorter than an average human being. Everything about the interior suggested that whoever had originally used this craft was perhaps 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with proportions quite different from human anatomy. What struck Lazar most powerfully about the interior was not just its alien geometry, but its profound simplicity. There were no control panels as he understood them, no displays or switches, or any of the complex interfaces that characterized human-built vehicles. Instead, there were smooth rectangular panels that seemed to be integrated directly into the craft's structure. These might have served as controls, but their function remained completely mysterious. There were no obvious ways to input commands or receive feedback about the craft's status. The reactor itself was positioned at the exact center of the vehicle, with waveguides extending upward toward what appeared to be an antenna or focusing device integrated into the craft's upper hull. Below the main level, accessed through a honeycomb-shaped hatch that was one of the few mechanical features Lazar could readily understand, were the gravity amplifiers that Barry had described. These were positioned in a triangular arrangement, each one capable of being rotated and aimed to direct the gravitational fields generated by the reactor. As he explored the craft's interior, Lazar became increasingly aware of being watched by other research teams who were working on different aspects of the vehicle. He wasn't permitted to communicate with them or even acknowledge their presence, but he could see them studying what appeared to be some kind of transparent panel embedded in the craft's superstructure. The panel seemed to shift between opacity and transparency, suggesting materials technology that was as advanced as the propulsion system itself. The upper level of the craft remained off limits during his visit, but Lazar could see dark, window-like panels that he suspected might be part of the craft's navigation or sensor systems. The entire vehicle felt like it had been designed with a completely different philosophy than any human-built machine. Where human engineering tended toward complexity and redundancy, with multiple systems providing backup capabilities, this craft seemed to embody an elegant simplicity that suggested a far more sophisticated understanding of the underlying physical principles. After spending several hours inside the sport model, documenting the placement of components and trying to understand the spatial relationships between different systems, Lazar emerged with a profound sense of having touched something that existed beyond the boundaries of human experience. The craft represented not just advanced technology, but an entirely different approach to solving the fundamental challenges of space travel and energy generation. The psychological impact of this experience was immediate and lasting. Lazar found himself questioning basic assumptions about physics, about engineering, about what was possible and what was merely a failure of human imagination. If this technology existed, If it worked according to principles that human science had not yet discovered, then what else might be possible? What other assumptions about the nature of reality might prove to be nothing more than the limitations of a young civilization's understanding? These questions would torment him during the long, sleepless nights that followed his exploration of the craft. The weight of the secret he was carrying seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, pressing down on him like a physical burden that affected every aspect of his existence. He was living simultaneously in two worlds: the ordinary reality of daily life in Las Vegas and the extraordinary realm of impossible technology hidden beneath the Nevada desert. The contrast between these two realities became increasingly difficult to manage. How do you engage in casual conversation about mundane topics when your mind is occupied with gravitational wave amplifiers and exotic matter reactors? How do you maintain relationships with people who have no idea that their fundamental understanding of the universe might be completely wrong? The isolation that had begun as a security requirement was becoming a psychological prison, cutting him off not just from professional colleagues, but from the entire framework of normal human experience. It was during this period of mounting internal pressure that Lazar began to make a series of decisions that would ultimately transform him from an anonymous scientist working on classified projects into one of the most controversial figures in modern UFO research. The choices he was about to make would violate every term of his security clearance, endanger his safety, and expose him to ridicule and attack from skeptics around the world. But they would also ensure that the extraordinary story of S4 and its impossible technology would survive, even if something happened to silence him permanently. The desert had shown him wonders beyond imagination, but it had also trapped him in a web of secrecy that was slowly destroying his ability to live a normal life. Something would have to give, and when it did, the reverberations would echo far beyond the hidden hangars carved into the Nevada mountains. The facility seemed different somehow during his next visits, charged with a tension that hadn't been present before. Security personnel moved with a heightened alertness that suggested something significant was happening behind the scenes. Conversations between researchers were even more carefully monitored than usual, and there was a sense that the project was approaching some kind of critical juncture. Barry mentioned in passing that there had been increased activity in some of the other hangars, suggesting that work on the various craft was being accelerated. The implications were troubling. Were they making genuine progress in understanding the technology, or was there some external pressure driving the increased pace of research? The compartmentalized nature of the project meant that such questions would remain unanswered, adding another layer of frustration to an already challenging situation. The reactor continued to yield its secrets reluctantly, revealing just enough of its operating principles to tantalize researchers while keeping its deepest mysteries locked away. Lazar and Barry had developed theories about how the gravitational effects were generated and focused, but translating theoretical understanding into practical application remained elusive. The gap between knowing what the device did and understanding how to build a similar device seemed as vast as the distance between Earth and the stars from which the technology had allegedly originated. The knowledge that these craft existed somewhere beyond the heavily guarded perimeter of S4 began to occupy Lazar's thoughts with increasing intensity. During the quiet moments between tests and measurements, his mind would wander to the implications of what he was witnessing. If 9 different craft were housed within the facility, each representing potentially different approaches to the same fundamental principles, then the scope of extraterrestrial visitation might be far greater than anyone had imagined. The diversity suggested possibilities that were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Perhaps these vehicles represented different eras of the same civilization's technology, like finding examples of human transportation ranging from horse-drawn carriages to supersonic jets. Or maybe they originated from entirely different worlds, evidence that Earth had become something of a crossroads for multiple spacefaring species over the course of centuries or millennia. Each possibility carried profound implications for humanity's place in the cosmic order. Were we being observed by a single advanced civilization, or had multiple species taken an interest in our small blue planet? Were these craft the result of deliberate contact, or had they been recovered from accidents and crashes scattered across decades of secret retrieval operations? The briefing documents provided frustratingly few answers to such fundamental questions, focusing instead on the technical challenges of reverse engineering technology that remained stubbornly incomprehensible. The work itself had settled into a routine that was anything but routine. Each day brought new attempts to understand the reactor's operating principles, new theories about how element 115 might be transmuted to release the exotic energy that powered the gravitational effects. Barry had become more talkative over time, sharing fragments of information that painted a picture of a project that had been ongoing for far longer than Lazar had initially realized. According to Barry, there had been previous teams of scientists working on similar challenges, researchers who had come and gone under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some had simply been reassigned to other projects after making little progress. Others had been removed for security violations or personal issues that compromised their clearances. And then there was Lazar's immediate predecessor, whose fate served as a constant reminder of the dangers inherent in working with forces that remained poorly understood. The psychological pressure of operating in such an environment was unlike anything Lazar had experienced in his previous scientific work. At Los Alamos, despite the classified nature of many projects, there had been a sense of community among researchers, opportunities to discuss theoretical problems and share insights across disciplinary boundaries. Here, the isolation was almost total, broken only by brief interactions with Barry and the occasional visit from Dennis, their supervisor, who maintained the kind of professional distance that made meaningful communication nearly impossible. Dennis himself was an enigma, a man who clearly possessed detailed knowledge of the project's broader scope, while revealing almost nothing about the context within which their specific work was taking place. His visits to the laboratory were brief and focused, designed to assess progress and identify obstacles rather than provide the kind of collaborative support that might have accelerated their research. There was something in his manner that suggested he was under pressure from higher authorities, people whose names never appeared in any documentation and whose existence could only be inferred from the careful way Dennis chose his words during their interactions. The irregular schedule continued to wreak havoc on Lazar's personal life, creating tensions that grew more difficult to manage with each passing week. The late-night phone calls summoning him to McCarran Airport had become a source of constant stress, not just for him, but for the people closest to him, who had no way of understanding why he would disappear without explanation for days at a time. The cover story about working on conventional propulsion research at a remote testing facility was wearing thin, particularly as the psychological strain of maintaining absolute secrecy began to affect his behavior in subtle but noticeable ways. The security clearance process had prepared him for routine surveillance, but living under constant observation was proving to be more psychologically challenging than he had anticipated. Phone conversations were monitored, mail was intercepted and examined, and there was always the awareness that his movements and associations were being tracked and analyzed by people whose job was to identify potential security risks. The knowledge that his private life was no longer private created a persistent undercurrent of paranoia that colored every interaction and decision. It was during this period of mounting stress that Lazar was granted another extraordinary privilege that would provide him with crucial insight into how the craft's propulsion system operated in practice. He was invited to witness a more extensive test flight, one that would demonstrate capabilities far beyond the brief hovering demonstration he had observed during his first month at the facility. The test was scheduled for a Wednesday evening, a timing choice that Barry explained was based on statistical analysis of traffic patterns on the highways surrounding the restricted area. Wednesday nights showed the lowest civilian activity, reducing the chances that the craft's movements might be observed by unauthorized witnesses. The level of detail that went into such operational security considerations was impressive, suggesting that the program had been running long enough to develop sophisticated protocols for maintaining secrecy. As sunset approached, Lazar found himself standing in the desert outside the hangar complex, watching as the sport model was wheeled into position on the dry lake bed. Under the harsh fluorescent lights that had been set up around the testing area, the craft looked almost mundane, like an oversized piece of industrial equipment rather than a machine capable of defying fundamental laws of physics. But Lazar had learned not to judge the technology by its appearance. The test crew moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this was far from the first such demonstration. Radio equipment was positioned and tested, safety perimeters were established, and what appeared to be recording equipment was set up at various locations around the testing area. The entire operation had the feel of something that had been refined through repetition, a carefully choreographed procedure designed to gather maximum data while minimizing risks. When the craft's systems came online, the change was immediately apparent even from a considerable distance. There was no dramatic visual display, no sudden burst of light or sound that announced the activation of impossible technology. Instead, there was simply a subtle shift in the air around the vehicle, a barely perceptible distortion that seemed to bend light in ways that made the craft appear slightly out of focus, even when viewed directly. The takeoff itself was as silent and effortless as Lazar had witnessed during the first demonstration, but this time the craft didn't simply hover and perform basic maneuvers. Instead, it began to move in ways that challenged every assumption about how objects traveled through space. It accelerated instantly to tremendous speeds without any visible acceleration phase, stopped just as suddenly without any deceleration, and changed direction at right angles without any apparent regard for inertia or momentum. What made the demonstration even more remarkable was the complete absence of any exhaust trail, sonic boom, or other indication that the craft was pushing against air or using reaction mass to generate thrust. It moved through the atmosphere as though the atmosphere didn't exist, as though it was traveling through an entirely different medium that offered no resistance to its passage. The implications for aerodynamics, for propulsion theory, for basic physics were staggering. The craft climbed to an altitude that took it beyond the surrounding mountain ranges, performing maneuvers at speeds that would have been impossible for any conventional aircraft. It would accelerate to what appeared to be thousands of miles per hour in seconds, then stop instantaneously and hover motionless before darting off in an entirely different direction. The display continued for perhaps 20 minutes, demonstrating capabilities that belonged more to the realm of science fiction than to any recognizable form of aerospace engineering. Throughout the demonstration, radio communication was maintained between the ground crew and whoever was piloting the craft. This detail struck Lazar as particularly significant, given his understanding of how the gravitational propulsion system was supposed to work. The intense gravitational fields generated by the craft should have distorted radio waves just as they distorted light and space itself. The fact that communication remained possible suggested either that his understanding of the technology was incomplete, or that there were aspects of the propulsion system that hadn't been explained to him. As the craft settled back to the ground with the same impossible grace with which it had taken off, Lazar realized that he had just witnessed a demonstration of technology that was so far beyond current human capabilities that it might as well have been magic. The reactor he studied in the laboratory wasn't just a curiosity or an interesting puzzle to be solved. It was the heart of a propulsion system that could revolutionize transportation, energy generation, and humanity's entire relationship with space and time. The ride back to the facility was conducted in the same silence that characterized most interactions at S4, but Lazar's mind was racing with implications and possibilities. If this technology could be understood and replicated, it would transform human civilization in ways that were difficult even to imagine. Interstellar travel would become routine, energy scarcity would become a thing of the past, and the fundamental limitations that had constrained human development throughout history would simply disappear. But the demonstration had also reinforced his growing awareness of just how far beyond human understanding this technology really was. The gap between what he was observing and what human science could explain wasn't just a matter of degree. It represented a fundamental discontinuity, a leap so profound that it challenged the very foundations of scientific knowledge. Working on this project wasn't just about reverse engineering advanced technology. It was about trying to comprehend principles that might require entirely new frameworks of understanding. The psychological impact of this realization was profound and lasting. Lazar found himself questioning not just specific theories or models, but the entire edifice of human knowledge about the nature of reality. If gravitational fields could be generated and manipulated with such precision, what other assumptions about physics might prove to be nothing more than the limitations of a primitive understanding? If consciousness could interface directly with technology in ways that eliminated the need for conventional controls, what did that suggest about the nature of mind and matter? These questions haunted him during the weeks that followed, creating a growing sense of isolation that went far beyond the security restrictions imposed by the project. He was living with knowledge that separated him not just from his colleagues and friends, but from the entire framework of consensus reality that most people took for granted. The weight of such secrets was becoming increasingly difficult to bear, particularly as the constraints of absolute secrecy made it impossible to process these experiences through normal channels of discussion and reflection. The irregular schedule and mounting psychological pressure were also taking their toll on his personal relationships in ways that he hadn't anticipated. The inability to explain his absences or share the source of his obvious stress was creating misunderstandings and suspicions that threatened to unravel the foundations of his private life. The security clearance requirements had seemed manageable in the abstract, but living under constant surveillance while maintaining elaborate deceptions about the nature of his work was proving to be far more challenging than he had imagined. It was during this period of mounting tension that events began to unfold that would ultimately force Lazar to make choices he had never wanted to face. The delicate balance between his secret professional life and his increasingly strained personal relationships was approaching a breaking point, and when that balance finally collapsed, the reverberations would extend far beyond the confines of the S4 facility. The first signs of trouble came not from any dramatic security breach or laboratory accident, but from the slow erosion of trust that inevitably accompanies a life built on necessary deceptions. The people closest to Lazar knew that something significant was happening in his professional life, but the absolute secrecy requirements made it impossible for him to provide the kind of reassurance and explanation that healthy relationships require. The late-night disappearances, the obvious stress, and the inability to discuss what was clearly the most important work of his career created a growing chasm that no amount of careful misdirection could bridge. The surveillance that was part of his security clearance meant that his handlers were aware of these personal difficulties long before Lazar himself fully understood their implications. Phone conversations were monitored, personal interactions were analyzed, and behavioral patterns were tracked with the kind of meticulous attention that intelligence agencies bring to potential security risks. What they discovered in the course of this monitoring would ultimately change everything, not just for Lazar's continued participation in the project, but for his safety and the safety of everyone connected to him. The call came on a Tuesday evening, summoning him not to McCarran Airport for another flight to the facility, but to a meeting at Indian Springs Air Force Base, a location he had never visited before. The tone of the conversation was different from the routine scheduling calls he had become accustomed to, carrying an undertone of urgency that immediately put him on edge. Something had changed, and the change was significant enough to warrant a departure from established protocols. The meeting itself was unlike any debriefing he had experienced during his time with the project. Instead of the usual technical discussions about reactor performance or gravitational field measurements, the focus was entirely on security and the maintenance of operational secrecy. The men who conducted the interview were not scientists or engineers, but security professionals whose job was to identify and neutralize potential threats to classified programs. What they revealed during that meeting would shatter any illusions Lazar might have maintained about his privacy or autonomy while working on the project. They knew everything about his personal life, including details that he had never shared with anyone and situations that he thought had remained completely private. The scope and depth of their surveillance was both impressive and deeply disturbing, a reminder that involvement in programs of this level of classification came with costs that extended far beyond professional obligations. The transcripts they presented were devastating in their intimacy and comprehensiveness, documenting not just his conversations, but the conversations of people close to him who had no knowledge of or connection to the classified work he was performing. The web of surveillance had extended to encompass his entire social network, creating a detailed map of relationships, vulnerabilities, and potential pressure points that could be used to ensure his continued compliance with security requirements. But it was what the transcripts revealed about his personal life that proved most damaging. The irregular schedule and constant secrecy had created exactly the kind of relationship instability that security professionals were trained to identify as a risk factor. The people closest to him had drawn their own conclusions about his unexplained absences and obvious stress, conclusions that were both understandable and completely wrong, but which had led to actions that compromised the careful balance he had been trying to maintain. The security team's response to these developments was swift and unambiguous. His participation in the project was being suspended immediately, not as punishment for any specific violation, but as a precautionary measure designed to prevent potential security breaches. The personal difficulties that had seemed like private matters were now classified as operational concerns, and his continued access to the facility and its extraordinary secrets would depend on how those concerns were resolved. The psychological impact of this development was profound and immediate. In the space of a single conversation, Lazar had gone from being a trusted insider working on the most advanced technology in human history to being a potential security risk whose access to classified information had been revoked. The work that had become the central focus of his professional life was suddenly off limits, leaving him with a mixture of technical knowledge and direct experience that he was forbidden to discuss or even acknowledge. Perhaps more troubling was the realization that the suspension might not be temporary. The security concerns that had triggered his removal from the project were not the kind of issues that could be easily resolved through administrative action. They reflected fundamental changes in his personal circumstances that had implications far beyond his professional qualifications or technical expertise. The possibility that he might never return to S4, never again work with technology that existed decades or centuries ahead of anything else on Earth, was both devastating and terrifying. The drive back to Las Vegas that evening was conducted in a silence that felt heavier than any he had experienced during his months of classified work. The desert landscape that had once seemed mysterious and full of hidden possibilities now felt empty and hostile, a barrier separating him from work that had given his life meaning and purpose. The lights of the city appeared on the horizon, like a beacon calling him back to ordinary reality, but the transition felt more like exile than homecoming. In the days and weeks that followed, Lazar found himself living in a strange, liminal space between the classified world he had been forced to leave behind and the ordinary world to which he was expected to return. The knowledge he carried about gravitational propulsion systems and exotic matter reactors remained as vivid and compelling as ever, but it was knowledge he could neither use nor share. He was trapped with secrets that were simultaneously the most important information he had ever encountered and the most dangerous burden he had ever carried. The isolation that had begun as a security requirement had now become a form of psychological imprisonment. He couldn't discuss his work with colleagues because the work was classified beyond any normal level of secrecy. He couldn't share his experiences with friends or family because those experiences challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality that most people use to navigate their daily lives. And he couldn't simply forget what he had learned, because the implications were too profound and the memories too vivid to be dismissed or ignored. It was during this period of enforced silence and growing frustration that Lazar began to consider options that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. The weight of carrying such extraordinary secrets alone was becoming unbearable, and the possibility that he might never be allowed to return to work that had become his passion was driving him toward decisions that would violate every principle of security and discretion that had governed his professional life. The desert winds that swept across the Nevada landscape during those sleepless nights seemed to whisper possibilities that were both terrifying and liberating. What if the secrecy itself was the problem? What if the compartmentalization and isolation that were supposed to protect classified information were actually preventing the kind of breakthrough insights that humanity desperately needed? What if the technology he had studied could transform civilization, but only if it was freed from the constraints of programs so classified that they could never achieve their full potential? These questions circled through his mind with increasing intensity, carrying him toward a decision that would transform him from an anonymous scientist working in classified obscurity to one of the most controversial figures in modern history. The choice he was contemplating would violate every term of his security clearance, expose him to legal prosecution and physical danger, and subject him to ridicule and attack from skeptics who would question every aspect of his character and credibility. But it would also ensure that the extraordinary story of S4 and its impossible technology would survive, even if something happened to prevent him from ever speaking about it again. The secrets that were slowly destroying his ability to live a normal life could become a gift to humanity, a revelation that might accelerate scientific progress by decades or centuries and open new chapters in our understanding of what was possible in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than most people dared to imagine. The decision, when it finally came, felt both inevitable and impossible, like stepping off a cliff, while simultaneously knowing that there was no other choice. The desert had shown him wonders beyond description, but it had also trapped him in a web of secrecy that was slowly strangling his soul. Something would have to give, and when it did, the reverberations would echo far beyond the hidden hangars carved into the Nevada mountains, carrying the story of impossible technology and extraterrestrial visitation into a world that was either ready to hear it or determined to silence it forever. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers that were both obvious and hidden, but it was the only path that offered any hope of transforming his burden of terrible knowledge into something that might ultimately benefit all of humanity. The choice had been made, and there would be no going back. The first person Lazar chose to confide in was someone who understood the strange intersection of aviation, government secrecy, and unexplained phenomena better than most. John Lear was a pilot whose family name was synonymous with private aviation, his father having founded the Lear Jet Corporation. But John himself had drifted into the shadowy world of conspiracy research, accumulating contacts throughout the intelligence community and developing theories about government cover-ups that most people dismissed as paranoid fantasy. What made Lear different from other conspiracy theorists was his access to sources within classified programs and his willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about things that officially didn't exist. When Lazar approached him with fragments of what he had witnessed at S4, Lear didn't respond with skepticism or dismissal. Instead, he listened with the careful attention of someone who had spent years piecing together patterns of government deception and technological secrecy. The conversations between Lazar and Lear took place in quiet restaurants and parked cars, locations chosen specifically to avoid the kind of electronic surveillance that both men knew was a constant presence in their lives. Lazar shared what he could without revealing details that might immediately compromise operational security, describing technology that operated on principles unknown to conventional science and craft that moved through the atmosphere as though physical laws were merely suggestions. Lear's response was both validating and terrifying. He had heard similar accounts from other sources, fragments of information that painted a picture of government programs so deeply classified that their very existence was known only to a handful of people. According to Lear, what Lazar had stumbled into was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, a decades-long effort to understand and potentially weaponize technology that had been recovered from sources that remained officially unacknowledged. But Lear also understood the dangers that Lazar faced as someone who possessed first-hand knowledge of these programs. History was littered with researchers and whistleblowers who had tried to bring such information to public attention, only to find their careers destroyed, their reputations shattered, and in some cases their lives cut short by accidents and suicides that seemed statistically improbable. The world of classified aerospace programs was not forgiving to those who violated its codes of silence. Despite these risks, Lear encouraged Lazar to document everything he could remember about his experiences at S4, not necessarily for immediate public release, but as a form of insurance policy that might protect him if his former employers decided that permanent silence was the only acceptable outcome. The theory was simple. If something happened to Lazar, the information would survive him, creating a deterrent effect that might discourage extreme measures. This advice led to hours of careful documentation, as Lazar worked to record every detail he could recall about the facility's layout, the technology he had studied, and the people he had worked with. The process was both therapeutic and disturbing, allowing him to process experiences that had seemed almost dreamlike in their impossibility, while also forcing him to confront the full scope of what he had witnessed. The act of writing down these experiences made them feel more real and more dangerous simultaneously. On paper, the claims seemed so extraordinary that they bordered on science fiction, yet Lazar's memories of the reactor's impossible effects and the sport model's gravity-defying flight remained as vivid and compelling as ever. The disconnect between the apparent impossibility of what he was describing and his absolute certainty that it had happened created a cognitive tension that was almost physically painful. As weeks passed without any word from his former employers about the possibility of returning to the project, Lazar began to suspect that his involvement with S4 might be permanently ended. The personal issues that had triggered his suspension showed no signs of easy resolution, and the security concerns that had been raised were not the kind that could be addressed through simple administrative procedures. He was facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life carrying extraordinary secrets that he could never use or share. The psychological pressure of this situation was compounded by signs that he remained under active surveillance despite his removal from the project. Cars that appeared to be following him, phone calls that ended abruptly when he answered, and encounters with people who seemed to know more about his daily routine than casual acquaintances should have known. The message was clear. Even though he was no longer working on classified projects, he was still considered a person of interest by people whose job was to protect government secrets. It was during this period of mounting paranoia and isolation that Lazar made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. If he was going to remain under surveillance indefinitely, if his access to the most important work he had ever done was going to be permanently denied, then perhaps it was time to consider options that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. The idea of going public with his story was both terrifying and liberating. It represented a complete break from the world of classified research and government secrecy that had defined his professional life, but it also offered the possibility of transforming his burden of terrible knowledge into something that might benefit humanity as a whole. If the technology he had studied could revolutionize transportation and energy generation, then perhaps the secrecy surrounding it was actually preventing progress that could improve the lives of millions of people. But going public would require more than just telling his story to anyone who would listen. It would need to be done in a way that maximized the chances of the information being taken seriously while minimizing the legal and physical risks that such disclosure would inevitably entail. This meant finding the right journalist, someone with the credibility and resources to investigate his claims, while also having the courage to publish information that would certainly be controversial and potentially dangerous. The choice of George Knapp as the journalist to break this story was not accidental. Knapp had already established himself as someone willing to tackle unusual subjects that other reporters might dismiss or ignore. His previous work on UFO-related topics had demonstrated both a healthy skepticism and a willingness to follow evidence wherever it might lead, even into territory that challenged conventional assumptions about what was possible or probable. When Lazar first approached Knapp through intermediaries, the journalist's initial response was cautious but interested. The claims being made were so extraordinary that they demanded exceptional evidence, but Lazar's apparent technical knowledge and his reluctance to seek publicity suggested that this might be different from the usual parade of UFO witnesses and conspiracy theorists who regularly contacted news organizations with fantastic stories. The process of verification began immediately, as Knapp used his investigative resources to check what could be checked about Lazar's background and claims. The results were mixed, creating a pattern that would characterize the entire Lazar story for decades to come. Some details could be verified and seemed to support his account, while others remained stubbornly unconfirmable, leaving plenty of room for both believers and skeptics to find evidence for their preferred interpretations. The decision to proceed with the story was not made lightly. Knapp understood that publishing Lazar's claims would likely end any chance of the physicist returning to classified work, and might expose both men to legal action or worse. But the potential significance of the information, if true, seemed to outweigh these risks. If even a fraction of what Lazar described was accurate, it represented one of the most important stories in human history. The first interview was conducted under conditions designed to protect Lazar's identity, while allowing him to tell his story in his own words. Seated in shadow and speaking in a voice altered to prevent recognition, he laid out the basic elements of his account: the secret facility, the recovered craft, the impossible technology, and the government program designed to understand and potentially replicate systems that seem to operate beyond the boundaries of known physics. The response to this initial broadcast was immediate and overwhelming. Phone lines at the television station were flooded with calls from viewers who wanted to know more, while UFO researchers and government watchdog groups began mobilizing to investigate the claims. The story had touched a nerve in the public consciousness, tapping into long-standing suspicions about government secrecy and the possibility that humanity was not alone in the universe. But the response from official sources was predictably swift and unforgiving. Within hours of the broadcast, efforts began to discredit both Lazar and his claims through a coordinated campaign that targeted every verifiable aspect of his background and character. Educational records were scrutinized, employment history was questioned, and personal issues were dragged into the spotlight in an apparent effort to destroy his credibility before his story could gain wider acceptance. The intensity of this response was, in some ways, as revealing as Lazar's original claims. If his story was simply the fantasy of a disturbed individual seeking attention, it seemed unlikely that such resources would be devoted to discrediting him. The apparent coordination of the debunking effort suggested that someone with significant influence was very concerned about the information he was sharing and the potential impact it might have on programs that were supposed to remain completely hidden from public view. Lazar himself seemed almost surprised by the vehemence of the attacks on his credibility and character. He had expected skepticism and perhaps some official denial, but the systematic effort to destroy his reputation seemed disproportionate to what he had actually revealed. Most of his claims remained unverifiable by their very nature, dealing with classified programs that officially didn't exist, and technology that was supposedly decades ahead of anything publicly acknowledged. The personal cost of going public became apparent almost immediately. Friends and colleagues who had previously treated him with respect began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who had become a controversial figure in UFO circles. Professional opportunities dried up as potential employers decided that hiring someone with his notoriety would create more problems than benefits. The comfortable anonymity of his previous life had been permanently shattered, replaced by a kind of fame that was more burden than blessing. Yet despite these costs, Lazar seemed strangely at peace with his decision to break his silence. The psychological pressure of carrying such extraordinary secrets alone had been replaced by a different kind of stress, the constant scrutiny and criticism that came with being a public figure making extraordinary claims. But at least now he could discuss his experiences openly, processing them through conversation and debate, rather than suffering in isolated silence. The story continued to evolve as new details emerged and additional witnesses came forward with supporting or contradictory information. Some people claimed to have worked at similar facilities or to have knowledge of related programs, while others provided technical analysis that either supported or challenged Lazar's descriptions of the technology he claimed to have studied. The debate became increasingly complex, with experts in various fields offering conflicting opinions about the plausibility of his account. Meanwhile, the facility at S4 remained as inaccessible as ever, hidden behind layers of security and official denial that made independent verification impossible. Satellite imagery of the area showed nothing obviously unusual, though supporters of Lazar's account argued that the camouflaged nature of the hangars he described would make them invisible from above. The debate over what might be hidden in the Nevada desert continued to rage without any definitive resolution. The psychological impact of living at the center of such controversy was profound and lasting. Lazar found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously famous and isolated, recognized by millions of people around the world, while being shunned by the scientific community he had once hoped to rejoin. His claims had made him a celebrity in UFO circles, but they had also made him unemployable in conventional scientific or technical fields. The weight of this isolation was compounded by the constant awareness that his former employers might still view him as a security threat, requiring ongoing monitoring or more direct intervention. Every unexpected phone call, every unfamiliar car in his neighborhood, every unusual coincidence carried the potential to be something more sinister than it appeared. The paranoia that had begun during his time at S4 had not diminished with his public disclosure. If anything, it had intensified as the stakes of the game became clearer. Yet through all of this, Lazar maintained a consistency in his account that impressed even some of his critics. Unlike many people who make extraordinary claims and then modify their stories when challenged, he stuck to the essential elements of his narrative with a stubbornness that suggested either remarkable dedication to a fabricated story or genuine conviction born of authentic experience. The details might vary slightly in different tellings, but the core claims remained unchanged across decades of interviews and investigations. This consistency became both a strength and a weakness in the ongoing debate over his credibility. Supporters pointed to it as evidence that he was telling the truth about genuinely experienced events, while critics argued that it simply demonstrated his commitment to maintaining a profitable deception. The fact that he seemed to derive little obvious benefit from his notoriety only complicated these interpretations, as did his apparent reluctance to capitalize on his fame through books, lectures, or other commercial ventures. The technology he described continued to seem impossibly advanced compared to anything publicly acknowledged, yet certain aspects of his account proved remarkably prescient as scientific understanding evolved. The gravitational waves he claimed were central to the craft's propulsion system were later confirmed to exist by sophisticated detection equipment, though the ability to generate and manipulate such waves remained far beyond human capabilities. Element 115, which he said powered the reactors, was eventually synthesized in particle accelerators, though only in quantities and with properties that bore little resemblance to his descriptions. These partial confirmations did nothing to resolve the fundamental questions surrounding his account, but they did prevent his claims from being dismissed entirely as scientific impossibilities. The universe, it seemed, was stranger and more complex than most people imagined, leaving room for possibilities that might have seemed absurd when first proposed, but which later proved to have some basis in emerging scientific understanding. The desert winds that had once whispered secrets now carried questions that might never be answered definitively. The hidden hangars that Lazar claimed to have seen remained as elusive as ever, protected by security measures that made verification impossible and official denials that made acknowledgement unlikely. The technology he described continued to represent capabilities so far beyond current human achievement that they seemed to belong more to science fiction than to any recognizable form of engineering. Yet the story persisted, carried forward by the power of possibility and the human need to believe that we are not alone in a universe that often seems vast and empty. Whether Lazar was a truth-teller who had glimpsed humanity's future, or a master fabricator who had created the perfect, unverifiable story, his account had become part of the cultural landscape, a modern myth that captured something essential about our hopes and fears regarding what might be hidden just beyond the edges of our understanding. The night sky above the Nevada desert held the same stars it had always held, but for those who had heard Lazar's story, those points of light now carried different meanings. Each one represented not just a distant sun, but a possible source of visitors who might have already walked among us, leaving behind technology that could transform our world if only we were wise enough to understand it and brave enough to use it. The silence of space no longer seemed empty. It seemed pregnant with possibilities that were both wonderful and terrifying, waiting to be discovered by a species that had perhaps already taken its first tentative steps toward joining a larger cosmic community. In the years that followed his public disclosure, Lazar would continue to live with the consequences of his decision to break his silence, carrying the burden of extraordinary claims that could neither be definitively proven nor completely dismissed. The desert that had shown him wonders beyond imagination had also transformed him into a figure of controversy and mystery, forever caught between the worlds of classified secrecy and public speculation. The technology he claimed to have studied remained tantalizingly out of reach, described in sufficient detail to capture the imagination, but lacking the concrete evidence needed to convince skeptics or advance scientific understanding. Whether it existed in hidden laboratories or only in the realm of possibility, it represented a future that seemed both inevitable and impossibly distant, a glimpse of what humanity might become if we could transcend the limitations that currently defined our existence. The story of S4 and its impossible secrets had become something larger than any individual account or claim. It had evolved into a symbol of all the questions that haunted human consciousness. Are we alone? What lies beyond the boundaries of our current understanding? What secrets might be hidden in the spaces between what we know and what we imagine? These questions continued to echo through the desert winds, carrying their mysteries into a future where answers might finally emerge or remain forever tantalizingly beyond our grasp. As the night deepens around you, and these extraordinary possibilities drift through your mind like distant memories of dreams, let yourself sink deeper into the comfort of your bed, knowing that somewhere out there, whether in hidden facilities or distant stars, wonders exist that surpass our wildest imaginings. The universe is vast and strange and full of secrets that may one day transform everything we think we know about reality itself. The gentle hum of desert silence wraps around you like a blanket woven from starlight and shadow, carrying whispers of possibilities that stretch far beyond the comfortable boundaries of ordinary sleep. As your breathing grows deeper and your mind begins to drift toward the threshold of dreams, let the weight of these extraordinary revelations settle around you with the softness of sand shifting beneath an endless sky. In the years that followed Bob Lazar's emergence from the shadows of classified secrecy, the ripple effects of his disclosure continued to spread through both the scientific community and the public consciousness, like waves moving across a still pond. The story he had shared wasn't simply a collection of technical claims or eyewitness accounts. It had become something more profound, a lens through which humanity could examine its own assumptions about what was possible and what might be hidden just beyond the edges of conventional understanding. The desert facility he described remained as elusive as ever, protected by barriers that were both physical and psychological. Official denials continued to flow from government sources with the steady rhythm of institutional machinery, each statement carefully crafted to deflect inquiry while revealing nothing of substance. Yet beneath these formal pronouncements lay a current of tension that suggested the story had touched something real, something that powerful people preferred to keep buried in the shifting sands of secrecy and time. Scientists and researchers around the world found themselves grappling with questions that Lazar's account had brought into sharp focus. If technology existed that could manipulate gravity with the precision he described, what did that mean for our understanding of the fundamental forces that shaped the universe? If materials like the stable isotope of element 115 could be harnessed to power such systems, what other possibilities lay hidden in the unexplored regions of the periodic table? These weren't merely academic questions. They pointed toward futures that could transform human civilization in ways that were difficult to imagine. The skeptics, of course, remained steadfast in their criticism, pointing to the gaps in documentation, the absence of physical evidence, and the inherently unverifiable nature of claims about classified programs. Their arguments carried weight, particularly in scientific circles, where extraordinary assertions demanded extraordinary proof. Yet even the most determined debunkers found it difficult to explain away certain aspects of Lazar's account, details that seemed to align with emerging scientific understanding in ways that would have been difficult to fabricate decades earlier. The hand scanner he had described, once dismissed as pure fantasy, had indeed proven to be real technology used at classified installations. The gravitational waves he claimed were central to the craft's operation had been confirmed to exist, even if humanity lacked the ability to generate them artificially. Element 115 had been synthesized, albeit in forms that bore little resemblance to the stable isotope he claimed to have worked with. Each partial confirmation served not to validate his entire account, but to demonstrate that the universe contained possibilities that conventional wisdom had yet to fully appreciate. Meanwhile, other witnesses began to emerge from the shadows, individuals who claimed knowledge of similar programs or related phenomena. Some spoke of underground facilities where recovered craft were studied by teams of scientists working under conditions of absolute secrecy. Others described encounters with technology that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of known physics, devices that could manipulate matter and energy in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality itself. These accounts, while varying in detail and credibility, began to paint a picture of a hidden world that existed parallel to the one most people knew. It was a realm where the impossible became routine, where the boundaries between science fiction and scientific fact dissolved into something more fluid and uncertain. Whether this world existed in underground laboratories or only in the collective imagination of those who chose to believe in it remained an open question, but its influence on human consciousness was undeniable. The psychological impact of living in a universe where such possibilities might exist was profound and far-reaching. For those who accepted the potential reality of advanced technologies hidden within classified programs, everyday life took on a different quality. The ordinary world of traffic lights and grocery stores continued to function according to familiar rules, but beneath its surface lay the awareness that revolutionary breakthroughs in transportation and energy generation might already exist, locked away from public view by layers of secrecy and institutional inertia. This awareness created a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance, a tension between the mundane realities of daily existence and the extraordinary possibilities that might be unfolding in hidden facilities around the world. People found themselves looking at conventional aircraft with new eyes, wondering what capabilities might be possible if the technological constraints they took for granted were merely artificial limitations rather than natural laws. The environmental implications alone were staggering to contemplate. If clean, unlimited energy could be generated using exotic matter reactors, the climate crisis that dominated political discussions could potentially be resolved overnight. If transportation systems could be developed that moved through space without burning fossil fuels or producing emissions, the entire structure of global commerce and communication could be fundamentally transformed. Yet these possibilities remain tantalizingly out of reach, protected by classification levels that place them beyond the influence of democratic processes or public oversight. The technology that could solve humanity's greatest challenges allegedly existed, but it remained locked away in programs so secret that their very existence was officially denied. The frustration of this situation was palpable among those who believed that such breakthroughs were being deliberately suppressed. The motives for maintaining such secrecy were complex and multifaceted, touching on national security concerns, economic interests, and the potential social disruption that might accompany the sudden availability of revolutionary technologies. Military applications were obvious and troubling. The ability to manipulate gravity could provide unprecedented advantages in warfare, creating weapons and defense systems that would render conventional military technology obsolete virtually overnight. Economic considerations were equally significant. If energy could be generated without fuel costs or environmental impact, entire industries built around fossil fuel extraction and distribution would become obsolete. The geopolitical implications of such a transformation would be enormous, potentially destabilizing regions whose economies depended on oil and gas exports, while creating new centers of power based on access to exotic technologies. Perhaps most challenging of all were the philosophical and spiritual implications of contact with advanced non-human intelligences. If the craft Lazar described truly originated from other worlds, their presence on Earth suggested that humanity was not alone in the universe, a revelation that would challenge religious beliefs, scientific paradigms, and fundamental assumptions about our place in the cosmic order. The careful management of such information might be seen as necessary to prevent social upheaval on a scale that could threaten the stability of civilization itself. These concerns, while understandable from the perspective of those charged with maintaining social order, created ethical dilemmas that seemed to grow more complex with each passing year. Did any group of people, regardless of their official authority, have the right to withhold information about technologies that could transform human civilization for the better? Could the potential risks of disclosure truly justify keeping humanity in ignorance about possibilities that might solve our greatest challenges? The debate over these questions continued to rage in academic circles, government corridors, and public forums, with passionate advocates on all sides arguing for their preferred approaches to the fundamental questions of secrecy, disclosure, and technological progress. Some called for immediate and complete transparency, arguing that humanity deserved to know the truth about what might be hidden in classified programs. Others advocated for gradual disclosure, a careful process of revealing information at a pace that society could absorb without catastrophic disruption. Still others maintained that certain secrets were too dangerous to share, that some knowledge required guardianship by those wise enough to understand its implications and responsible enough to prevent its misuse. This perspective, while paternalistic in its assumptions about public capacity to handle difficult truths, reflected genuine concerns about the potential consequences of releasing information that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in human society. As these debates continued to unfold across multiple decades, the original questions raised by Lazar's account remained as relevant as ever. The technology he described continued to represent possibilities that seemed both inevitable and impossibly distant, glimpses of a future that might already exist in hidden laboratories or might remain forever beyond human reach. The desert winds that had once carried the sound of impossible craft moving through the Nevada sky continued to blow across landscapes that held their secrets close. The mountains that allegedly concealed advanced technologies remained as silent and mysterious as ever, their rocky faces revealing nothing of what might lie hidden within their depths. The dry lake beds where test flights might have demonstrated capabilities beyond imagination stretched empty under star-filled skies that seemed to pulse with unspoken possibilities. For those who had heard Lazar's story and found it compelling, the world had been permanently transformed. Every unexplained light in the sky, every government denial of unusual phenomena, every hint of advanced technologies being developed in classified programs carried the potential to be connected to the larger tapestry of hidden knowledge that his account had revealed. The comfortable certainties of consensus reality had been replaced by a more complex and uncertain landscape, where extraordinary possibilities lurked just beyond the edges of official acknowledgement. The scientific community remained divided in its response to the implications of his claims. Conservative researchers maintained that extraordinary assertions required extraordinary evidence, and that the absence of verifiable proof relegated such accounts to the realm of speculation rather than serious investigation. Yet a growing number of scientists found themselves intrigued by the possibilities that exotic propulsion systems and exotic matter technologies might offer, even if they remained skeptical about the specific claims surrounding their alleged existence. Research into gravitational physics, exotic matter states, and advanced propulsion concepts continued to advance through conventional channels, driven by both military interest and scientific curiosity about the fundamental nature of reality. While none of these investigations had yet produced the breakthrough technologies that Lazar described, they had revealed aspects of the universe that suggested such capabilities might not be impossible, merely beyond current human understanding and technological capability. The quantum realm, in particular, had proven to be far stranger and more malleable than earlier generations of physicists had imagined. Phenomena like quantum entanglement, quantum tunneling, and quantum field fluctuations pointed toward aspects of reality that seemed to operate according to rules that defied common sense and classical understanding. If consciousness could influence quantum systems, if information could be transmitted instantaneously across vast distances, if energy could be extracted from the vacuum of space itself, then perhaps the technologies Lazar described were not violations of natural law, but applications of principles that human science had yet to fully discover. These scientific developments, while not providing direct support for his specific claims, created an intellectual atmosphere where such possibilities seemed less absurd than they might have appeared in earlier eras. The universe was revealing itself to be far more complex and surprising than previous generations had supposed, leaving room for capabilities that might once have been dismissed as pure fantasy. The technological landscape was also evolving in ways that made some aspects of Lazar's account seem more plausible. Advances in materials science had produced substances with properties that would have seemed magical to earlier generations. Metamaterials could bend light around objects, creating invisibility effects that had once existed only in science fiction. Superconductors could levitate objects using magnetic fields, demonstrating that gravity was not the only force capable of producing anti-gravitational effects. Computer processing power had reached levels that allowed for simulations of complex physical systems with unprecedented accuracy. Artificial intelligence was beginning to demonstrate capabilities in pattern recognition and problem-solving that surpassed human performance in specific domains. While these developments fell far short of the advanced technologies that Lazar described, they illustrated the rapid pace of technological change and the difficulty of predicting what might be possible in future decades. The space exploration programs of various nations had also revealed aspects of the solar system that suggested the universe was far more dynamic and complex than previously understood. Evidence of liquid water on multiple moons, organic compounds in meteorites, and potentially habitable environments on distant planets had made the possibility of extraterrestrial life seem not just plausible, but probable. While no definitive proof of alien civilizations had yet been discovered through conventional channels, the statistical likelihood that Earth was unique in harboring life had steadily diminished as astronomical knowledge expanded. These developments created a context in which claims about recovered alien technology seemed less extraordinary than they might have in earlier eras. If life was common throughout the universe, if some of that life had evolved into technologically advanced civilizations, and if some of those civilizations had developed interstellar travel capabilities, then the presence of alien artifacts on Earth became a logical possibility rather than a violation of known reality. The absence of open contact between human and alien civilizations could be explained through various theoretical frameworks that didn't require dismissing the possibility of such contact occurring through hidden channels. Perhaps advanced civilizations practiced non-interference policies that prevented direct contact with developing species like humanity. Perhaps contact was being managed through governmental channels that kept such interactions secret to prevent social disruption. Perhaps the vast distances between star systems made contact so rare and difficult that only occasional artifacts or crashed vehicles provided evidence of alien presence. Each of these possibilities offered potential explanations for why Lazar's account might be true, even in the absence of widespread public evidence for alien visitation. The universe was vast enough and strange enough to contain realities that exceeded human imagination, and the history of science was filled with examples of phenomena that were initially dismissed as impossible before being accepted as natural aspects of reality. The psychological and sociological implications of living in a universe where such hidden realities might exist continued to influence human consciousness in subtle but significant ways. The awareness that revolutionary technologies might already exist, that contact with alien civilizations might be occurring through secret programs, that the boundaries of the possible were far broader than conventional wisdom suggested, created a sense of anticipation and uncertainty that colored contemporary culture. Science fiction had always served as a laboratory for exploring hypothetical futures and alternative realities, but Lazar's account suggested that some of the most exotic scenarios from speculative fiction might already be unfolding in hidden facilities around the world. The gap between imagination and reality seemed to be narrowing, creating a cultural atmosphere where the extraordinary felt increasingly possible, and the impossible seemed merely improbable. This shift in collective consciousness was reflected in everything from popular entertainment to academic research, as creators and thinkers grappled with implications that extended far beyond the specific claims of any individual witness. The questions that Lazar's story had raised about secrecy, technological progress, and humanity's place in the universe resonated with broader concerns about democracy, transparency, and the pace of change in contemporary society. The desire for truth and disclosure competed with concerns about stability and security, creating tensions that seemed likely to persist, regardless of what might eventually be revealed about the reality behind claims of recovered alien technology. These were not merely technical or scientific questions. They touched on fundamental issues of power, knowledge, and the right of human beings to understand the nature of the reality they inhabited. As you drift deeper into the realm of sleep, let these vast questions and infinite possibilities settle around you like layers of dream and memory. The desert winds continue to blow across landscapes that hold their secrets close, carrying whispers of technologies that might transform everything we think we know about what is possible in this strange and wonderful universe. Whether hidden in underground facilities or existing only in the realm of human imagination, these possibilities represent something profound about our species' endless quest to push beyond the boundaries of the known and venture into territories that challenge our deepest assumptions about reality itself. The story of Bob Lazar and S4 has become part of a larger narrative about human curiosity, courage, and the eternal search for truth in a cosmos that seems determined to guard its most extraordinary secrets. Rest now in the knowledge that the universe is vast and full of wonders that exceed our current understanding, that possibilities exist which could transform human civilization in ways both beautiful and profound, and that somewhere in the spaces between what we know and what we dream, truth awaits discovery by minds brave enough to question everything and imagine anything. The stars above continue their ancient dance, each point of light a potential doorway to realities we have yet to comprehend, while the earth below holds secrets that may one day emerge from the shadows to illuminate new chapters in the story of human consciousness and cosmic understanding. In this space between sleeping and waking, between knowing and wondering, between the possible and the impossible, let yourself drift into dreams that carry the seeds of tomorrow's revelations.